On December 25, 1995, in Beverly Hills, under the quiet of an uncharacteristically empty Christmas, the phone rang at Jerry Lewis's imposing mansion. The news came not as a shock, but as the inevitable conclusion of a 12-year sentence of absence, confirming that Dean Martin, the missing half and the source of his deepest grievance, had fallen silent forever. Martin's absence, the easy-smiling straight man, was already a ghost in Lewis's life, but his death transformed the emptiness into a physical reality, a black hole that swallowed the light of a decade of resentment and unshakable pride, leaving Lewis not with mourning, but with a sudden and cold certainty that time, the one resource that could not be bought in Hollywood, had run out, and with it, the possibility of amends. The stage of life, which they had dominated together, now had only one actor, and the applause had been replaced by the dry sound of the phone on the hook, a sound that echoed the phrase Lewis had uttered in 1956. "You're just a singer, I'm the star." The atmosphere this Christmas morning was gray. The sunlight filtered through the blinds of Lewis's great room was faint, creating long shadows over Persian carpets and award statuettes. The air was heavy, charged not with festivity, but with a quietness that screamed isolation, punctuated only by the distant crackle of a fireplace, lit more out of habit than need for warmth. A crystal glass, half full of a forgotten amber liquid, was on the side table, reflecting the dull light like a melancholic jewel, while the smell of pine and the lack of familiar voices transformed the house's opulence into a gilded cage, a desolate setting for the man who had invented joy on stage but could not find it in the silence of his own living room. This is the stage where pride finally pays its highest price, at the instant when regret no longer finds ears to receive it. Before we proceed, if you want more powerful stories like this, which reveal the human fragility behind the shine of entertainment, comment your opinion on the weight of lost time right below. Leave your like to support us, and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue bringing intense and reflective accounts like this to your screen. The world of the Martin and Lewis duo exploded in post-war America in 1946, a vibrant contrast of light and shadow that defined show business for a decade. It was the smoky world of New York nightclubs, where the sound of ice clinking in whiskey glasses mixed with the hysterical laughter of audiences eager to forget the sobriety of war. Dean Martin, the Italian crooner, impeccable in his tuxedo and with a velvety voice, brought the elegance of cool, the ironic calm of one who seemed not to care, while Jerry Lewis, the host of chaos, was the personification of uncontrolled energy, a hyperactive child trapped in an adult's body, knocking over waiters, making absurd faces, and dismantling the solemnity of the show. Together, they were a perfect equation, the yin and yang of comedy, the calm that made Lewis's frenzy tolerable, and the frenzy that kept Martin's charm from becoming boring, generating a chemistry that the film industry soon realized was pure gold, signing million-dollar contracts with Paramount. This partnership was not just professional. It was the manifestation of a deep brotherhood that blossomed backstage, far from the lights of Las Vegas, built on the foundation of two ambitious souls who found in each other the missing piece to escape obscurity. Lewis saw in Martin the mentor, the calm older brother who validated him, while Martin saw in Lewis the creative engine, the inexhaustible source of jokes and scripts that propelled both their careers at a staggering speed. Lewis's initial emotional state was one of pure adoration and creative dependence on Martin, the man he respected above all, the only one capable of controlling his ego and his stage panic, a dynamic that was reflected in all their films, where the chaotic Lewis was always brought back to reality by Martin's serenity and voice, validating the belief that the partnership was greater than the sum of its individual parts. However, as fame swelled bank accounts and public adoration became deafening, the seed of discord began to germinate, planted in the fertile soil of ego and insecurity. Martin, despite being the anchor and the object of female desire, began to feel undervalued, receiving less credit for Lewis's creation, relegated to the role of the man who merely smiled and sang while Lewis dismantled the conventions of the show. Lewis, in turn, increasingly intoxicated by critical attention and invitations to direct, yearned to be seen not just as the clown, but as the auteur, the creative genius behind the machine, and this desperate need for artistic validation led him to subtly undermine Martin's role, seeking total control over the duo's content, an obsession that turned the backstage into a minefield of repressed tension, where public smiles hid a growing and silent resentment. The temporal mark of 1954/1955 signaled the decisive inflection point, when Lewis's creative control at Paramount became almost absolute, resulting in films that tended to concentrate on his mannerisms and his physical performance, diminishing Martin's screen time and dramatic substance. A concrete object that symbolizes this change is the editing room that Lewis practically monopolized, transforming the set into a reflection of his mind and no longer of a partnership, making Martin feel like a mere well-dressed prop. The social scenario of Hollywood, which idolized the genius Lewis, reinforced this unhealthy dynamic, with agents and executives praising Lewis's creative control, while ignoring the growing silence and tired look of Martin, who drank increasingly in his dressing rooms, seeking to calm his partner was stealing from him, signaling that the partnership, once a safe harbor, had become an unequal battlefield where only one of the two could be the winner. The year was 1956, and the accumulated tension reached its peak at the legendary Copacabana in New York, stage of their last joint show on July 25th. The shift was clear. The vibrant energy that once united them now drove them apart on stage, transforming the perfect synchronicity into a series of forced gestures and empty glances, with Martin barely disguising his boredom and Lewis trying to fill the void with more and more frenzy, as if he could compensate for the absence of the partnerships. Soul merely with the body. The audience, accustomed to the magic and the palpable intimacy of the duo, began to sense the crack, realizing that the joy was a mask and that something fundamental had died between the two men, a feeling of betrayal that hung in the smoky air of the club. The final catalyst for the rift, the key event that broke all balance, was a phrase uttered by Lewis during a heated argument backstage, a verbal poison that he would never be able to remove from his friend's memory or his own. In a fit of frustration and uncontrolled ego, Lewis fired at his partner. "You're just a singer, I'm the star." A surgical blow that targeted the heart of Martin's dignity, reducing his contribution to a footnote and claiming the decade's success for himself. The declaration was not just a fight between friends. It was the betrayal of the man Martin had pulled from the sidelines and the public denial of his worth. A phrase that resonated louder than all the applause they had shared, and that set the tone for the separation that was to come. The impact of that phrase was immediate and devastating. Martin, who always prized his cool demeanor and self-control, did not retaliate with shouts, but with the most eloquent silence Lewis had ever experienced, a stillness that expressed the final decision to end the partnership right there. He put on his suit, picked up his keys, and walked out the door, leaving Lewis alone in the dressing room, surrounded by a chaos of makeup and clothes, realizing belatedly the mortal weight of his words, but still unable to swallow his pride to call his friend back. The final scene at the Copacabana was not one of rehearsed drama, but of a painful surrender, with Dean Martin abandoning not just the stage, but the identity of Martin and Lewis, opting for the peace of creative solitude instead of the constant struggle for recognition alongside his partner. The result of the inciting incident was the explosive separation, formalized a few hours later, with a mutual refusal to fulfill a $5 million contract that would have guaranteed them more years of working together, an astronomical sum for the time, which solidified the irreversibility of the decision. What had been born of friendship and mutual genius, now died by oversized ego and lack of respect, marking not only the end of the most lucrative duo in Hollywood, but the beginning of an icy and public silent war that would last 20 years. The perceptible shift for the viewer was clear. The screen of joy had broken, and the story would now be about the price of success and the loneliness of the man who chose individual glory over true connection. After the 1956 breakup, Lewis and Martin's destinies followed divergent paths, but the absence of the other became a phantom weight in both careers. Martin, with his inherent calm, reinvented himself in cinema and, with the help of Frank Sinatra, anchored the Rat Pack, transforming himself into an icon of cool and effortless success, proving to Lewis, in silence, that he was much more than just a singer. Lewis, on the other hand, channeled his frantic energy into directing, achieving the recognition as an auteur he so desired. But his personality, freed from Martin's counterbalance, became more isolated, more self-centered, and more demanding on sets, where creative genius coexisted with an increasingly difficult temper, and the friend's absence was filled by excessive creative control. A scene from 1961 shows Lewis, alone, in the editing studio, watching the dailies of The Nutty Professor, a moment of forced introspection. He laughs at his own antics on screen, but a second later the laugh dies on his lips, and the camera focuses on a small frame where Lewis, for an instant, seems to look at an empty spot next to him, where Martin once stood, revealing the emotional rift he was trying to fill with work. The painful discovery for Lewis was that, although he had conquered the title of genius, the laughter he provoked seemed to have lost some of its resonance, lacking Martin's anchor, the straight man who gave him context and made him human, a perception that led him to work harder, in a vicious cycle of exhaustion and creative solitude. Meanwhile, Martin enjoyed the camaraderie of the Rat Pack in Las Vegas, and the 1962 scene, on the stage of the Sands, shows him relaxed, sharing jokes and whiskey with Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. But a quick glance from Martin at the emptiness of the reserved table, where Lewis would never sit, suggests that not even collective success completely filled the lack of the original partner. Doubt began to corrode Lewis in the following years, manifested in recurring insomnia, in which he caught himself replaying the fateful phrase of 1956, realizing that, in his thirst for control, he had wounded the only person who loved him unconditionally in the chaos of Hollywood, transforming the grievance into silent guilt. In 1976, in one of the most electrifying moments in showbiz history, Frank Sinatra, the figure of authority trying to heal the wound, orchestrated a surprise reunion at Lewis's annual muscular dystrophy telethon, a cause that had become Lewis's new focus. On stage, Sinatra announces Martin's presence, and the transition shows Lewis's shock, a mixture of panic and childlike joy, as Martin enters and the two embrace in front of millions of viewers, a gesture of public truce that seemed to promise an end to the decades of resentment. The emotion was palpable. Lewis, visibly shaken, could not hide the sudden re-entry of light into his life, and Martin, in his always controlled demeanor, dedicated a phrase of affection to Lewis. But backstage, the old grievance, like a symbolic object, resurfaced, preventing the moment from evolving into full reconciliation. The transition shows the two men separating after the telethon. Lewis's shock turns into frustration when latent pride, the same weakness that had caused the original break, prevents him from calling Martin the next day, subtly rejecting the chance for a new start offered by Sinatra. Time advances, and in 1987, tragedy strikes Dean Martin when his son, Dean Paul Martin, dies in a plane crash, a devastating event that shakes Lewis's emotional fragility thousands of miles away. Martin's pain was so deep that it reverberated through the walls of Hollywood and hit Lewis hard, who, driven by empathy, finally relented and made a call to his old friend, breaking the 12-year silence imposed after the 1976 telethon. The short phone conversation, although filled with sincere condolences, was not a moment of full forgiveness or reconciliation, but a mutual acknowledgement that life was more fragile than pride, a temporary truce forced by death and mourning. Lewis's fragility is revealed in the inability to maintain contact after the mourning, and the friendship returns to its formal distance, with both men trapped in their narratives of victimization and the weight of the past, seeing in the other's absence the mutual punishment. Lewis begins collecting old videos of the duo, turning them into a symbolic object of his solitary introspection. Martin's laugh, once the soundtrack of his life, was now the sound of a memory he could not touch or recreate. Lewis's ambition, once his engine, becomes a burden, as he realizes that all the awards and the recognition as an auteur cannot fill the void left by the loss of the friendship he sacrificed on the altar of ego and control. The final micro-scene of this section in the 90s shows Dean Martin, aged and ill, walking on the beach alone, a shocking contrast to the vibrant figure of the Rat Pack. And Lewis, upon seeing a recent photo of his friend in a magazine, feels a cold shock of guilt upon noticing the fragility and loneliness of the man he helped push away. I want to know your opinion about this moment in 1987. Comment what you would do if, after years of grievance, The only thing that led you to call a friend was a tragedy. The discovery is that grievance and resentment kept Martin alive in Lewis's mind. But now, with Martin's health fading, Lewis faces the imminence of total absence, fearing that the end will arrive before forgiveness. In the years that followed Martin's son's death, the crooner's physical deterioration accelerated, closely followed, but from a distance, by Lewis, who transformed himself into a passive observer of his old friend's decay. He read Martin's health reports in the gossip columns, the news about the use of a wheelchair and the reclusiveness of the man who was synonymous with laid-back elegance, and each new headline acted like a progressive hammer on the wall of pride he had built. This forced distance increased the emotional weight of the narrative. Lewis knew that time was running out, and with each passing day without genuine contact, the desire to mend the past collided with the inertia of decades cultivated resentment. The fear of imminent death began to internally pressure Lewis, transforming his luxurious isolation into a chamber of psychological torture. He found himself tormented by the prospect that the last word between them had been the cruel phrase of 1956, and that the telethon reconciliation had been merely a public stopgap, not a soul-searching reckoning. This feeling of urgency was unfair, as it forced Lewis to face not only Martin's mortality, but his own moral failure, the silent confession that his ego had stolen the most precious resource, the decades of friendship that could have been lived, and which were now irretrievable. A scene of growing tension shows Lewis standing in front of a storefront, observing a black and white photo of the duo in their heyday, the frozen image of two young men smiling, and he touches the glass as if he wanted to cross it. The contrast between the captured joviality and the grim reality of the present was the physical proof of the irreparable loss, and Lewis's pain was not that of an estranged friend, but that of a man who destroyed a masterpiece and now could only contemplate the ruins. This symbolic object, the photo, amplified the emotional pressure, forcing the memory of the perfect chemistry he had repudiated. The emotional pressure reaches a new level in the fall of 1995. Martin's health was worsening alarmingly, and Lewis, now obsessed with the idea of a last meeting, called a mutual friend, trying to find out if Dean would accept him. The answer was always vague and evasive, a sign that the wall of hurt Martin had built to protect himself was as high as the one Lewis maintained out of pride. The painful realization was that, perhaps, Martin's peace already lay in the acceptance of the distance, and the need for forgiveness was exclusively Lewis's, not the man who was dying. This pressure manifests itself in Lewis's routine, who spent hours reviewing the old films, searching in them for a trace of the unconditional love Martin offered him in youth, and the sound of the Copacabana audiences laughing in the 50s became the constant noise in his mansion, a sound that was once triumph and now was accusation. The urgency of a final gesture becomes Lewis's sole motivation, but pride, now disguised as fear of rejection, paralyzes him. The expectation for the culminating moment was set. Lewis's fear was not of losing Martin, the absence was already a fact, but of losing the opportunity for an honest reckoning, of not being able to say, "I'm sorry," before the possibility was silenced forever. And he knew, deep down, that Martin's death would be the final verdict on his own humanity. Christmas 1995 arrived, bringing with it the inevitable, cold, and brutal news. Dean Martin had died. The shock was not from surprise, but from finality, because at the exact moment of death, the door to reconciliation slammed shut with a deafening noise in Lewis's consciousness, transforming the holiday into a landmark of irreversible regret. Lewis received the call and, unlike the frantic panic of other moments in his life, responded with an icy quietness, a total silence that spoke louder than any shout, because he knew that, over the decades, pride had signed the death sentence of the friendship and stolen the time they needed to heal the wound. The central scene charged with tension occurs days later. At the time of the funeral, Lewis refuses to go. His gesture, apparently a final act of grievance, was, in fact, a complex and painful manifestation of mixed pride and guilt, an inability to face his friend's family and coffin, and, simultaneously, a visceral fear of facing himself in the presence of Martin's absence. He remained locked in his house, watching the funeral coverage on television, and the silence of the mansion was broken only by the monotonous sound of the newscast and, ironically, by the background music that played one of Martin's classic songs, transforming the song into a lament. The great symbolic gesture, the most important turning point, was not an action, but a stillness. The moment Lewis turns off the television and walks to his closet, where he keeps, like a relic, one of Martin's suits, which he had received as a gift years ago and never had the courage to wear or throw away. He touches the fabric with his fingertips, and the cold texture of the cloth hits him with the certainty that human fragility, which he had explored so much in comedy, was the only real thing left between them. There, in that dark room, without witnesses, Lewis's ego collapses. The climax is, therefore, pure and raw regret, Lewis's realization, in that post-funeral silence, that he felt no hatred, but rather a deep love, and the unbearable guilt of having allowed a single phrase, spoken in a moment of fury, to condemn him to live the rest of his life, without the only person who truly understood him on stage. The moment is unforgettable, because the man who lived for noise and frenzy finds his climax in an absolute silence, where the past imposes itself immovably. The direct consequences of Lewis's silent climax manifested a few months later, in 1996, in the form of a television special dedicated to commemorating the duo's glory, a stage Lewis initially intended to boycott, but which transformed into the place of his final and public reckoning. Unable to reconcile in private, he chose the only place that always united the two, the stage, turning the tribute into his private funeral for his friend. This act altered the atmosphere of Hollywood, which finally saw the master comedian strip away his public persona of untouchable genius to reveal himself as a fragile and repentant human being who needed forgiveness more than applause. Lewis took to the stage and, before the cameras and an attentive audience, uttered the words he couldn't say on Christmas 1995 or in any of the previous years, speaking of Dean Martin with a tenderness and pain that seemed to come from a place of emotional purity, without the filter of ego. The scene was one of emotional closure, because he was not praising Martin, but rather apologizing to the wind, confessing his love and, crucially, verbalizing the futility of the fight. You can't have hate. For 12 years. It wasn't worth it. The meaning was clear. Pride is a heavy burden one cannot carry. The conclusion is that the stage, which had witnessed the birth of the magic and the death of the partnership in 1956, now witnessed Lewis's solitary redemption, the moment he accepted that the grievance was a costly mistake, and that Martin, even absent, had freed him from the weight of resentment. In delivering the eulogy, Lewis was, in fact, forgiving himself, transmitting a profound humanity to the audience by showing that even the greatest legends are made of flaws, and that forgiveness, even if late and symbolic, was the only path to personal peace. The story of Martin and Lewis ends not as a Hollywood tragedy, but as a bittersweet parable about the cost of ego, revealing that the true star of the narrative was the friendship that both allowed to be sacrificed in the name of vanity and creative control. Martin's absence in Lewis's life served as a relentless mirror to the comedian, showing him that all success is hollow if there is no heart to share it with, and that the loudest laugh he provoked in the audience never managed to drown out the silence of his own regret. What was lost was not only decades of shows and films, but the most genuine part of Lewis that only Dean Martin could extract. And this irretrievable loss leads us to a final reflection on life's most valuable currency: time. Lewis recovered his humanity only when he confronted the friend's definitive absence, and the public catharsis of 1996, although curative for him, did not return the lost time, but only marked the exact moment when forgiveness, finally, conquered pride. And in your opinion, what does this story reveal about the complex relationship between character, success, and difficult choices? Leave your comment.